Thank you for starting your day early with us here in Europe. Pleasure, to be with us. Maybe you want to introduce yourself, Kenneth and Brent, first.
Sure, great to be with you all. I'm Kenny Aycock from the FDA and our Office of Science and Engineering Labs within CDRH, on the device side. And I've been doing computational modeling work since I joined the agency. It's great to share some of that with you today.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm Brent Craven from FDA. I've been at FDA for about 10 years doing computational modeling. I'm our science advisor for computer modeling and simulation, and kind of coordinate a lot of our research and policy initiatives for computational modeling. It's great to join you.
Thank you. And now joining me here on stage, we are going to see more. I'm going to have, Dr. David Hoganson, who you saw already this morning, and now joining us also as part of being in the enrichment project. We have Dr. Claudio Capelli from UCLA London joining us, and Dr. Steve Levine. I don't need to present. So as I say, this team, it's more than a round table here. It's a group. Could almost say a group of friends. Some of them are missing here, but this is what we have been working all together, coming from the different horizons. And maybe David, Claudio, and Steve, you can also just say a few words to introduce yourself in context of this project that you have been running together. Huh?
Yeah, so it was a great privilege to be part of this effort. I was one of the clinical voices in this effort, and certainly it was exciting to start to think about some of the modeling and simulation we've done in the clinical realm to start to translate that to a different phase of the patient's care and these in silico clinical trials. And I think from my very biased perspective, I think some of the impact of this may be greatest in pediatrics, where the challenge of clinical trials are great. The resources to accomplish those are often hard to come by. And so we're really excited about how this will play a role in pediatric devices and technologies.
David, Claudio?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Claudio Capelli. Yeah, I'm a researcher at University College London and Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children, which is the largest pediatric hospital in the UK. So I work basically in a very similar field as David on the other side, but together, for using computer modeling and simulation in practice. And within the Enrichment project, I was representing somehow the academic bioengineering group, and together with a colleague from Swansea University, Sanjay Pant, we were working together really to bridge, as we do more or less in our research life, the two worlds, the two type of modeling. On one side, the patient's device interaction and the virtual cohort with the clinical modeling and clinicians. So this was our role of advising and working with this amazing group, part of Enrichment.
Thank you, Claudio. Steve, what have you been doing in Enrichment?
Yeah. So my role in the Enrichment project, much like what I've shared, a lot of my role was coordinating the project and really acknowledging, in fact, the vision when we started the project coming directly from Jeff Shuren, the head of CDRH at the time, who liked the concept. He recognized, and I'll share a quote from him later about his perspective on the importance of it. But what was important was that he said, look, I want you guys to work on this project, but don't go off in a corner and do a piece of science and then tell the world what you did. Bring them along with you. So that by the time we get to the end, all stakeholders in the community understand it, know how to use it, have challenged it, and are ready to implement those parts that are ready. And so that was a particular challenge, but fortunately we got an amazing response. We had as many as 75 people all working in different parts of the project. And so I want to, even though there's only a handful of us represented here, over the course of the last 5 years, there's been as many as 70 people who have donated their time to help advance this field that we'll be talking about today.
From more than 50 entities, organizations. Also want to mention that Kenneth, Brent, and Steve have been the co-principal investigator on this project, and therefore also, wants to be mentioned here, so that when you hear their voice, also speaking as being the principal investigator of it. So now, what is this project about? And we thought, let's have the first introduction of the project and present it, what was the ambition of the project, and who best than Kenneth to bring it and to describe it to us in the next 5 minutes. So, Kenneth, the floor is yours.
Thanks, everyone. I think you're going to see recording here. I'm Kenny Aycock from the Food and Drug Administration Center for Devices and Radiological Health and our Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories. And I'm excited to share with you an update on our project focused on credibility assessment of in silico clinical trials for medical devices. First, some context. About a year ago, November 2023, FDA published a final guidance assessing the credibility of computational modeling and simulation in medical device submissions. The guidance provides FDA's current thinking on credibility assessment for modeling studies used to support regulatory submissions. The guidance builds upon ASME V&V 40 2018 and prior FDA guidance for reporting of computational modeling studies. The guidance also provides perspective on new principles, such as the reliance on clinical data to support simulation validation, and the emerging topic of using modeling and simulation to drive in silico clinical trials for medical devices. However, the guidance does not address the specific challenges associated with assessing the credibility of a complex model like an in silico clinical trial, and it doesn't provide in silico clinical trial examples. Our team, with input from several advisory councils, developed a hierarchical framework for credibility assessment of in silico clinical trials for medical devices, which was recently published in Frontiers in Medicine and is openly available online. I will now briefly summarize the proposed hierarchical credibility assessment framework. We first propose organizing in silico clinical trials into 6 submodels: models for the device, for the patient, for the device and patient, and anticipated interactions between the two during an intervention, for a virtual cohort and anticipated patient-to-patient variability, for the clinician, and anticipated variability in clinical decision-making, and for clinical outcomes. These 6 submodels are then strategically combined to simulate a real human clinical trial with its associated variability. First, device and patient models are fed and driven by initial and boundary conditions, along with any other needed input variables that are calculated from the clinician and virtual cohort models. Virtual interventions are then performed to predict acute physics-based quantities of interest in a stochastic manner. Finally, these acute physics-based quantities are converted to clinical outcomes and predictions of safety and effectiveness endpoints using appropriate mapping models. Note the framework proposes assessing credibility hierarchically, step by step, largely inspired by best practices in other documents such as ASME V&V 10. By assessing the credibility of each submodel in isolation, we can identify errors that might otherwise propagate and corrupt the in silico clinical trial predictions, and thereby help ensure that the overall in silico clinical trial model predicts the right answers for the right reasons. One key challenge to establishing in silico clinical trial credibility is determining what evidence should be collected. To facilitate planning within the manuscript, we provide suggestions regarding the appropriate evidence categories from the new FDA guidance that may be relevant to support the credibility of each in silico clinical trial submodel. Another key challenge to establishing in silico clinical trial credibility is knowing when to gather that evidence. In the manuscript, we also propose several time points along the total product lifecycle where gathering this evidence is anticipated to be most practical. The manuscript concludes with an appendix that steps through the framework using a hypothetical in silico clinical trial example for an implantable cardiovascular device. We are again excited to share our progress with you and invite you to read more details in the open access manuscript online. A huge thank you to everyone involved, and I'll now turn the time back over to you and to Steve Levine for his perspective.
Thank you, Kenneth. So a very, big introduction about what it is about. And now I would like Steve to say some additional word about how you look at it more from the industry and implementation perspective as the other principal investigator into it.
Well, thanks. And I was not smart enough, as Kenny was, to record my part in advance, so you're going to have to live with me here live. So Kenny did a great job of really highlighting the really amazing achievement that was brought together really by working with the FDA and that incredibly structured process to be able to make us understand how to organize the information so that they can practically process it. I'll provide a little bit more context here, a little bit about how you might use that. Here, I begin both with sharing a quote I mentioned from Dr. Shurin. I think, as Jean mentioned, this was actually a picture was taken at that meeting, which I believe was possibly the very last meeting at the FDA prior to the COVID pandemic. And it may well be possible that as Dr. Shurin was seeing his phone kind of blow up with responses is when he was motivated to really talk about the challenging process and the way that we go about regulating. In fact, he talked about the entire process because he understands that the regulatory process is part of something, saying it's really out of date and it's time to change the world. And he really motivated us to see if we could rethink how we bring products to market. And I wanted to acknowledge both his words of support and, of course, all the people that contributed who were physically there. And I think there were another 20 or so online. So you've heard this term in silico clinical trial a number of times. Many of you know what it means. I like to think of it as not a single thing. Part of it depends on when you're doing it. The idea of in silico clinical trial sometimes confuses people. In silico representing sort of the Latin for in a computer, but representing a clinical experience, not necessarily in the clinic, but replicating the clinical experience, which means effectively in a patient. And so that can be done, I sort of show at 3 stages here. Very early on, before you actually work with real patients, so you can start before you get any clinical data, which is a great way to help you ensure that you understand the condition properly, the device that you want to create. What we're going to talk about is in the clinical world, so now you have at least some real data to validate and establish credibility, and possibly in post-market when you actually want to manage, and as we heard earlier, being able to use this to guide your actual treatment. So what we're going to talk about is this phase, and of course what we learn in this phase can be used in all the others. So I alluded to, I apologize for this very crowded slide, but this information is all available. We have representatives from 2 of the 3 councils. We organized a clinical council, a scientific advisory council, and an industry council to make sure we had both the clinical perspective, that it really represented what a clinician would observe, what they would see. The Scientific Advisory Council to make sure that we were following the best practices necessary, and the Industry Council to make sure you could actually implement. And then we had teams that were set up to do everything. And we made some adjustments along the way as people came on board. And in the end, as Kenny alluded to, we had what we called colloquially the Playbook, which was now published and announced just yesterday as a manuscript. So what we defined was a step-by-step process where we created a parallel between a real clinical trial and an in silico clinical trial. Because you're including the patient, you're including the treatment, you're including the interaction between the treatment and the patient, there's an analog between what you do in the real world and what you do in the in silico world. And you can establish credibility at each step. And that's important that you can't do when you're simply looking at, say, a device in the laboratory. You're only looking at one piece in isolation. So you can take your process through your device, through the entire process in the in silico clinical trial, the way you would do it in parallel with the real. And again, we think that's an important paradigm. And so what we came up with, and Kenny alluded to the test case that we did. So in this case, we started with real patients for validation. We used, in this case, we used data that was collected for the laboratory, I think provided, eventually processed by Dr. Hoganson's team. You saw the competency they have in recreating human anatomy, so we went to that team. So we got patient data, they processed it. We used that to generate virtual twins of those patients. And then, so we could establish credibility of those patients based on real patients. And that was then used actually to feed a AI model, which then took the very complex, full-dimensional 3D model of the heart and represented it in a very rapid AI model that you could then generate thousands, hundreds of thousands, because it only takes seconds at that point. And it's very well trained because the in silico model, the 3D model, has an incredible amount of information in it, unlike the clinical record, which is missing all the human physiology that's behind it. And then that was then used to generate an entire cohort. And all of this is documented, as Kenny said, in the publication. And so once you have this population, you can then do whatever you like with that population. You can test it and see if it actually passes the criteria. Did it meet the inclusion criteria? Did it meet the success criteria, et cetera? And then, more importantly, you can decide whether your device is going to work and why, or in who. So I'll just go very quickly through kind of a simple example. So we chose a mitral valve repair device as the example. And so one of the things that comes out of the analysis is, what are the criteria about a patient that will respond versus a patient that won't respond? So again, this is a little bit detailed. I won't go into it in much detail, but you can see the difference between a successful patient and a non-successful patient, and the artificial intelligence can actually go in and tell you in very fine detail. In this case, the most telling factor was a very complicated geometric ratio that would be almost impossible for a radiologist to figure out. You'd have to know you were looking for it to be able to go in and make these measurements, where the AI can pull that information directly out of it. And that was a key indicator of whether or not that patient was going to be successful or not. So if you're designing a trial or deciding to give treatment later on, you can identify and screen your patients accordingly. And so you end up with this sort of decision tree to decide where your patient, you can design your inclusion criteria or not based on population. And that's why we called it enrichment, because you can actually enrich your population with patients that are likely to be the ones to respond, therefore de-risking your trial, and of course giving guidance to clinical care to say, okay, these are the kind of patients that are appropriate, and drive adoption more quickly. You can get secondary, I won't go into it, there are secondary effects as well. So in the end, of course, you end up with a population that you can reuse because they're computer patients. Unlike the real clinical trial patients, you can't go back and ask them to come in and be tested again. The virtual patients don't mind being tested on the next generation of the device and the next generation of the device. And so we provide all of that content through the in silico clinical trial. Okay.
Thank you, Steve. So now that you have shared with the audience what you meant with enrichment, what is the DNA of this project, let's discuss a little bit further so that we can discuss it with the people. So maybe the first questions is about for Kenneth and Brent online, because from your perspective, what were the biggest challenges in determining the criteria for establishing the credibility of an in silico clinical trial? As we heard a lot about credibility tonight. So Kenneth, you want to start, or Brent?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. This was really interesting for us to tackle, and trying to understand how to assess the credibility of a model where you have really so many moving parts, and at the end you're predicting something that's quite removed from physics potentially. Trying to predict clinical endpoints. So I think the biggest challenge was really knowing how to demonstrate the credibility of the whole process, and knowing what evidence to collect. In the manuscript, we provide a lot of guidance and sort of a skeleton to fill in regarding how to organize the models and where to show that the predictions of the device are accurate, the predictions of the patient are accurate, predictions of the cohort are accurate, and that everything feeds together properly so that the final outcomes are trustworthy and can be relied upon. And we identify also the types of evidence, which is something that's novel in the guidance from FDA, that can help in planning what activities you perform to support the overall process.
Yeah, so I think speaking for the credibility assessment team, Steve had showed the diagram with all the different teams. When we first started looking at credibility assessment, it was extremely challenging. There were just so many different pieces in the ICT that were intertwined, and they all affect credibility. So I think that initially was probably the biggest challenge, just to how do we tackle the credibility of an ICT that has so many different parts that are intertwined. So when it occurred to us to break up an ICT into these different submodels like Kenny described, and then separately verify and validate each one of them, so we can be confident that the output going from one part of the model to the other of the model, part of the ICT, is accurate. That really kind of was a moment of enlightenment for us, that we could really figure out how to perform credibility assessment. So I think that was probably the biggest challenge in my mind. And then demonstrating in a practical example with mitral valve IACT was also a challenge. How to work through the data that we need to establish credibility for each of the different components. I think that was a secondary challenge. But overall, I think it's going to be an excellent example for the community that can hopefully push this emerging technology forward.
Thank you. So lots of richness, lots of diversity. And maybe here I'm looking at the physician here on stage, and maybe to provide us examples where the virtual twin offer insights beyond the possible with the traditional clinical trials. What's your view on this, David?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of both opportunities and challenges. In the sense that the in silico clinical trial can give really precise predictions about certain hemodynamic parameters, for example, in the cardiac device that we modeled. But as Kenny and Brent were saying, then tough to translate to the FDA endpoints, in which they were extremely clear when we met, in 2020, that they weren't going to bend the endpoints, the clinical endpoints that would be required for the device to match what would come out of the model. So I think it's really important as we consider devices that would actually move through a real in silico clinical trial, to how to make that translation to both capture relevant data out of the model that is important for understand the outcome of the device, but also how to translate those into the clinical outcomes that the FDA is going to measure the device trial by. So I think it's I think those have been important things that we learn throughout the process, and we're looking to apply when we do this for a real device.
So Steve, when in your introduction you are mentioning this 75 project members, this diversity of people contributing to the projects. So how, how is this? What did we learn from this? And what do you think people have learned from this? And where is this leading us? This diversity of community here.
Well, it's a recurring theme in this field. Having the different disciplines come together really helped us appreciate not just the challenges, whether you were on the medical side, the industry side, the science side, the regulator side, and even learning that under the umbrella of regulator, there are different responsibilities. There's statistical analysis, there's scientific credibility, domain experts. So we learned how to assess a single problem from multiple perspectives, and also, as were alluded to earlier, how the kind of virtualizing the information allows people to share data in a way that documents have not. So the current trial information is generally in closed documents, but actually creating an open system created a dialogue where people could interpret the data more effectively across discipline. And I think we carried out the project, as we said, the vast majority of the project during the pandemic. So after that meeting, that was the singular meeting we had in person to carry out this project. No one ever met in person after that. And we couldn't have possibly done that without the ability to virtualize.
So just before, as we had the ethical discussion, I was also wondering about further about it and how in silico clinical trial address ethical concern in clinical trial involving human subjects, and what new ethical consideration does this introduce? Maybe, Kenneth, do you want to say a few words about this?
Yeah, I'll provide my perspective. I'm not an expert in clinical trial ethics, but I think there's a couple of key points to consider here. So first, on one hand, there's really a good opportunity to address the ability to gather data on populations we otherwise would not be able to study. There's some clinical trials that may not be ethical to perform. It may be difficult to anticipate the risks and benefits in a manner that you can justify initiating a trial. It may be too risky or too unclear whether there will be benefit. And there may be some patient populations that are just very difficult to recruit. So ISCTs provide an opportunity and really an avenue for getting data that we just wouldn't otherwise be able to collect if we can study those edge cases and populations using models where we don't put anyone at risk. That's incredible. So on the other hand, some ethical considerations for performing ISCTs and concerns that could be raised. One is the need to ensure, of course, proper treatment of privacy of any data used to calibrate or validate those models. There is going to be a lot of data needed to be able to establish both to develop, calibrate, and validate. So there's going to be a lot of laboratory data, but also a lot of patient data involved in that process. And also in the collection of that data, there may be a need to collect some types of data that normally are not part of the typical intervention. For example, higher resolution or time-resolved imaging data. There may be some dosing concerns involved there that have to make sure those risks to patients are properly mitigated, and we're not putting patients at additional risk to support initiating the in silico clinical trial. And then finally, I think at the end of the day, it also comes back to credibility of the in silico clinical trial. Any decision-making that we end up influencing with in silico clinical trials, we want to make sure that's the evidence is there to show we can trust the trial, that we're not making decisions on computational models that are potentially have limitations and could lead to the wrong decisions. But at the end of the day, I think if we properly harness the technology, the upside is huge.
Thank you. And maybe a last general enrichment question, and maybe here for you, Claudio, as you're doing research in a lab that is inside an hospital in contact with the entire industry, basically. So how do you see the role of the virtual twin evolving in medical device and healthcare industry over the next 3, 5, 10 years?
Yeah, today, as Steve yesterday highlighted the program, today is the day of the future. I mean, it's where we imagine and the future of virtual twins in our overall field. But it's not very difficult to imagine this future today, because I think over the past couple of days we really saw application already happening today of elements of the how we use virtual twins to already advanced healthcare, as was shown brilliantly this morning, how we study new design and for a new device, how do we integrate AI data and so on. So the revolution is happening already now. But if I have to pick maybe one area where I see the biggest promise, obviously I'm incredibly biased about that because it's the part of the work that I know better, but I think the supporting the area where the numbers of patients are less, meaning rare disease, pediatric disease, but also, as presented very nicely also yesterday, there are forms of cancer which are more rare and so on. I think there is the medical area overall, where then the device and the healthcare industry and the research can happen more and can help more thanks to the virtual twins, because the real data are scarcer, the situation are more difficult, so augmenting the knowledge overall with this technology can help more, and on each side, from the conceptualization of a new treatment to the delivery and the follow-up of a single patient.
Thank you. David, I'm sure you have a view on this also.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think that you know, Kenny and Claudio both touched on this. You know, that we're going to have to restructure how we think about clinical trials to have an in silico clinical component, right? And so, where we traditionally, you know, minimized extra data collection, we're really going to have to think through the data that goes into the models and how we're going to get that data from the patients as we go. And so I think we're going to have to sort of restructure how we think about those clinical trials designed, and that really plays into, at least in the early phases, which type of devices, what type of treatments are really going to be most suitable, while we build you know, the credibility with the whole community that this is a process that's really going to work. I mean, obviously the framework we put together is terrific, but then we got to do it, right? And we need to do it in a careful way. And so I think early on, you know, I think that's one of the challenges that I see, is how do you select those first few in silico clinical trials and do that well, and validate those models well, validate that patient data well, have it really conform with the physical cohort, and get the whole effort off the ground well. So I think as we do that, we're going to start to see applications in all those areas Claudio mentioned, and there's, you know, there's many. I think more than we know is happening in the adult space right now. It's just not all getting to the regulators, whether it's happening before the regulators see the project or in parallel with the clinical trials. I think a lot of companies have invested in this area, and it's just a matter of how we democratize that effort and make that more open to the community, because I think a lot is being done already.
A lot of perspectives, for sure. So maybe let's have a few questions on the more the biomedical engineering side, and so maybe for you, Claudio, to start with. So for you, what were the key technological innovation in developing the virtual patient models? Okay, and what could be the broader implication from there?
Yeah, sure. This is was one of the most exciting part, again, coming from my biomedical engineering background, in following closely the activities of the Enrichment project. And again, we started speaking about synthetic population in these days, or synthetic data, or virtual cohort, whatever we want to call it, but it's a digital representation of patients. And the challenge in the Enrichment project was creating this population who should realistically replicate the characteristics of multiple patients with a specific pathology we would be enrolled in a real clinical trial. And this is very easy to say, very easy to imagine, but very complex to put it in action. And the complexity relies basically on multiple aspects. The fact that the data that we wanted to basically input are complex. They come from real clinical scenarios. There is sometimes the relationship between clinical or medical input and outcome are linear, fine. Sometimes it's much more complex. Sometimes it's unknown. Sometimes there are a lot of relationship and correlationship between the inputs. So that is a very complex process. And so I would say that the biggest advancement that I had the possibility to follow closely, but a lot of credit goes to the Dassault team, in particular to Tom and Zheng, to name two individuals who work a lot on these particular aspects of the creation of the virtual cohort, was really putting into action this one. And they did it together by taking data from the literature, taking data from the clinical world, making a first model, finite element model, very physics driven, enriching that possibility with surrogate models, training surrogate models with this data, and enriching, finally augmenting the population, generating a very large population. And then importantly, obviously I go a bit high level and simplify, but importantly they also added filter information to make sure that the virtual cohort of patients continue to be realistic throughout the process. Because that, and from a regulatory point of view, obviously, that is extremely important. We need to have checkpoints. We need to assess the credibility of the process throughout it, and make sure that some of the results of this process were still in line with the overall mission. So, yeah, that one I think is, we learn a lot throughout this process, and that process and how we assess the credibility of the process is something that hopefully will influence the community working in this field in the near future.
So as you mentioned the physics-based model. So, you know, one advantage of the physics-based model is the transparency of the model, inputs and outputs. And here in this project, AI has been used. So I'm sure, Steve, you would be interested to say, you know, how did AI contribute to creating the virtual cohort and predicting the clinical outcome in the enrichment project?
Well, of course, this is a very important topic for a number of reasons. Of course, we're all hearing a lot about artificial intelligence and large language models. We've been using artificial intelligence, with these models since the very beginning. We've recognized that, in many ways, these virtual twins speak the language of a computer better than it speaks the language of a human. And so the computer doesn't have to move it around, take it apart to understand what's happening. All of that information is very well processed by the artificial intelligence. And you have, unlike a lot of the training that happens with these large language models, you have a closed loop, so you can go back and do the test. You know what it should be. When you're training on actual humans, you don't know necessarily whether it got it right, and we could check that. So we can say, okay, if I give it this, does my surrogate model give me the right answer? So I can compare the human, I compare the virtual twin, and I can compare the AI. And of course, we had the luxury of being able to be very rigorous in that, and to be able to test how strong those surrogate models were. And surprisingly, or maybe not, depending on how you look at it, they were quite good. And I think it validated the hypothesis that when you add all of the physiological information about what we know about how something like the heart works or a valve to the clinical observation, you get a much richer model than you would get if you just trained it on the clinical observation. And I think that is a missing piece and an important learning that we got from the project.
So we still have time to address some area in regulatory further. So maybe a question for you, Brent. You've been talking about the November 2023 guidance published by the FDA. There have been then this 2024 in silico clinical trial enrichment publication. And how would you describe the FDA openness to virtual patient data into the regulatory process?
I would say we're very open to it. IACTs are specifically called out in our new FDA model credibility guidance as a form of regulatory evidence. And in fact, in this project, in the enrichment project with the manuscript that we just published, we follow that new guidance to provide an example of how to use the guidance for an IACT. With that said, we're very open to it, but also there's challenges that we highlighted in that manuscript of performing model credibility assessments. So, whenever you perform an IACT, oftentimes you're going to have to address some of these challenges. For example, like Dr. Hoganson pointed out, predicting the same clinical endpoints that you would normally see in a clinical trial. That's a major challenge that you'd have to address when performing an IST. But overall, I think we're very open to it, and there's a lot of documentation now available on how to do it.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I think this enrichment publication has been the first example coming after the guidance published in 2023. So.
Yes, that's right.
So maybe, Kenneth, a question for you. As the in silico clinical trial is still in this early stage for regulatory use, what advice do you have for those developing or using those models to speed up the adoption and acceptance?
Yeah, thank you. I'll keep this short. I think basically two things. One is to follow best practices wherever they are relevant to your advice area, from literature, from standards, organizations, from FDA guidance documents. That will definitely help you. And secondly, to come to FDA early with a IQ submission. That's an opportunity to engage with the review team that is specific to your advice area. You can get tailored, specific feedback to your area and application.
Thank you. So I think we have still time for a few last questions. Maybe on the clinical practice implication. A question for you, David, and for you, Claudio. So what concern should be considered when using the approach and when we are developing or using those models? So, when you're making the clinical decision, what do you think we should really be looking after? And how do you think that the input from the in silico clinical trial is helping to structure the studies now for the future?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I think that Steve had highlighted a couple different uses of the in silico clinical trial, not just as a virtual patient cohort to parallel a physical patient cohort, but I would say that we're working through some of this now as we're advancing new workflows into the clinical realm and trying to understand how do you in a way consistent with the credibility guidance of the FDA and good practice, make sure those are ready, right? And so definitely there's a preclinical validation piece, with benchtop work in some instances, but there's also an opportunity, much like the in silico clinical trial framework lays out, to then do that in a series of patients. And you saw an example of how we've done 6 aortic arch, patch planning cases. It's really an element of an in silico clinical trial. Those are retrospective work to try to understand, does this seem feasible in these patients, and is this geometry that seems like it's going to work? And so I do think there's going to be a very important role of that, particularly as we get past the more straightforward uses of modeling and simulation in the clinical world and get into more complicated ones, really setting up a framework to use these kind of methodologies to proceed safely into clinical use, and perhaps even even a framework of a clinical trial could be considered. There's a couple different areas, particularly Claudio and I were talking about the Fontaine simulations, and doing that in a broader scale, and whether or not a clinical trial would make sense. And you could imagine doing that as an in-silico clinical trial, not for approval of a device per se, but just for the responsible conduct of that. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, very briefly, because David, I think, said a lot of things, and I agree with them all. I think, basically, if I have to really shorten it, two main points. One, the clinical decision-making process. We have the ambition, the vision to help the decision-making process. But that is a process per se. So it's very important that obviously we check every tools that we use that they are correct, that they are maybe FDA marked and so on. But at the end, it's the process which needs to be credible and assessed. And I think what we learn in this during this process is indeed the suggesting ways how to assess such a process. And number two, again, following up with what David was saying, I think there is a real opportunity because in silico clinical trial can be done basically based on the amount of data, on the huge amount of data that we at clinical centers and research centers all around the world have been accumulated. So we cut a lot the cost of recruiting new patients and so on. So especially at the early stages, I think we have the opportunity to do two things. One, testing the modality per se, and two, testing on data that are already there, and how to transform them and use them obviously ethically and legally with synthetic data and so on is now at basically we can go there.
Thank you. I think it's now time to conclude. We are at the top of the hour. I know, we have had so many discussions and we could stay here for the next weekend, but I think we are coming now here at the end. Maybe in one sentence for each of you, how has your involvement with the enrichment project altered your perceptions of the role of in silico models in the life cycle of innovation?
Well, I'm going to change it to what changed over the course of the 5 years of my involvement was not the role of in silico clinical trial, but the role of the FDA. They went from being I don't want to say obstinate, but being a driver. And it's really much down to the leadership of the team. They recognized the importance, the challenge, and took the leadership. And I think that is an important message to the field that it's time to embrace Dr. Shuren's words and change the world.
Thank you, Steve.
To me, I mean, even before the enrichment project started, obviously I was believer, adopter, and so on. But enrichment changed me in a way to focus again on the process, and in particular the process. The aspect which obsessed me throughout these years was the mapping. How do we link the results of simulations to clinical outcome? And that is probably the biggest challenge and the most fascinating one for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think, my background is in medical devices before I became a physician, and I think it just remains very exciting how both the in silico development of medical devices, much like we do cars and airplanes, could really be accelerated, and the combination of that and in silico clinical trials, really you can envision a world where devices could quickly move from concept to clinical use, where historically the life cycle has been about 10 years from concept to initial clinical approval, and that's a really long time, particularly for these patient groups who really need them. So I think the vision of this really shortening that time span and getting devices much quicker into patients is a huge promise, and I think that's going to be realized.
Thank you. Kenneth and Brent?
Thank you. Yeah, this project has been quite eye-opening. One thing that I learned a lot about was just the difficulty of executing a traditional clinical trial. and seeing how many barriers there are to that process, and that highlights the really potential breadth of impact of this work. Is fantastic to be exposed to all the collaborators, research in their different areas they're working in, and just networking with so many people to hear about the kind of models that are being developed, seeing Dr. Hoganson's work and all the folks involved. So I think there's a lot of exciting things that will be forthcoming as we've laid this kind of roadmap for how to proceed.
Yeah, in my view, I think the enrichment project has largely taken ICTs that were previously kind of conceptual. There are a lot of ideas for how to for performing ICTs, but it's made it much more practical and feasible. So especially with regard to credibility assessment. So I think this project has really laid the groundwork for how to perform an ICT in practice and how to demonstrate its credibility. And I think that's going to be one of the most significant contributions that we made moving forward.
Thank you. Well, I think, this is definitely now opening a new way, what I've seen here, what you achieve here, and definitely key milestones on the way where making what's the next phase of personalized medicine is going to be in the future, and how we can better take care of patients. That's definitely, I think, an important milestone on it. So I really want to thank very warmly all of the panelists here remotely, but also all of the 75 people, we could not list all of them, that have been contributing to this. Some are here in the room, some are remote. But this has been really a fantastic journey, a collaborative journey. And now let's make the best use of it.